My husband stood up during our son's wedding reception, grabbed the microphone, and announced to 200 guests that I was nothing more than a glorified housekeeper who had never contributed anything meaningful to our family. The room went dead silent. Our son's face turned white with horror. And me? I smiled, because I knew something David didn't. By the end of that night, he would discover exactly what happens when you humiliate the wrong woman in front of everyone she loves. Hi, beautiful souls. I'm Tina, and I'm here to share stories that touch the deepest parts of our hearts, the moments that change us forever. Today's story is about betrayal, public humiliation, and the kind of revenge that comes not from anger, but from finally standing in your own power. This is a story about what happens when a woman decides she's done being taken for granted. And trust me, you're going to want to hear every single word, because by the end, you'll understand why sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people show the world exactly who they really are. If these kinds of real, raw stories speak to your soul, go ahead and hit that like button now and make sure you're subscribed, because we're building something special here together. A community where every story matters and every voice is heard. Let me take you back to that Saturday afternoon in June when I thought I was attending the happiest day of my son Michael's life. I had spent 3 months planning every detail of this wedding with my daughter-in-law Sarah, from the hand-selected flowers that matched her grandmother's china to the custom menu that honored both families' traditions. At 48, I had dedicated 26 years of my life to being the perfect wife to David Morrison, a successful pharmaceutical executive who earned 7 figures annually and never let anyone forget it. I had raised our 3 children, managed our household, hosted countless business dinners that advanced his career, and maintained the kind of social connections that had helped him climb the corporate ladder year after year. But somehow, in David's version of our story, I was just the woman who happened to live in his house and spend his money. The wedding ceremony had been absolutely perfect. Michael looked so handsome in his navy suit, tears streaming down his face as Sarah walked down the aisle in the vintage lace dress we had found together at a small boutique in Charleston. I had sat in the front row, watching my baby boy become a husband, feeling that bittersweet mixture of pride and letting go that every mother knows. David had been charming throughout the day, playing the role of the devoted father and successful patriarch, shaking hands with Sarah's family, making jokes about gaining a daughter, acting like the kind of man any woman would be lucky to call her husband. If I hadn't known him for over 2 decades, I might have believed the performance myself. The reception was held at the historic Riverside Manor, a stunning venue I had personally selected after visiting 14 different locations over 2 months. The ballroom was transformed with thousands of white roses and soft candlelight, creating the romantic atmosphere Sarah had dreamed of since she was a little girl. The band I had hired after listening to dozens of musicians filled the room with music that had every generation on the dance floor. The photographer I had researched and booked 8 months in advance was capturing every precious moment. The caterer I had personally taste tested with was serving a menu that had guests asking for recipes. Every detail was executed flawlessly because I had spent countless hours ensuring this day would be perfect for my son and his new wife. During the cocktail hour, I mingled with guests from both families, sharing stories about Michael's childhood, laughing about wedding planning adventures with Sarah's mother, and accepting compliments about how beautiful everything looked. Several people commented on how lucky David was to have a wife who could orchestrate such an elegant event, how clear it was that I had poured my heart into making this day special. I smiled and thanked them, but inside, I was thinking about something I had discovered just 3 weeks earlier. Something that was about to change everything I thought I knew about my marriage and my worth as a human being. 3 weeks before the wedding, while looking for our insurance papers to add Sarah to our family policy, I had stumbled across a folder in David's home office that contained documents I was never supposed to see. Bank statements showing a secret account with over $800,000, investment portfolios I knew nothing about, and most devastating of all, a prenuptial agreement I had never signed, never even seen, that somehow had my forged signature at the bottom. According to this document, I was entitled to virtually nothing if our marriage ended, despite 26 years of partnership, despite raising his children, despite sacrificing my own career dreams to support his ambitions. The signature wasn't even a good forgery, but apparently David had been confident that I would never be smart enough or curious enough to go looking for financial documents. That night, sitting in my car outside Michael's apartment, where I had gone to deliver some wedding gifts that had been shipped to our house, I called my college roommate Jennifer, who had become a family attorney. Through tears, I explained what I had found, and she arranged for me to meet with her colleague Patricia the next morning. Patricia took one look at the forged prenup and smiled the kind of smile that meant someone was about to get exactly what they deserved. She explained that not only was the document completely invalid due to the forgery, but David's attempt to defraud me of my legal rights made him liable for significant financial penalties. She also informed me that as David's wife, I was legally entitled to half of everything, including assets he thought he had hidden from me. Patricia had given me a choice that would define the rest of my life. I could confront David immediately, file for divorce, and take him to court for fraud and forgery. Or I could wait, gather more evidence, and let him dig his own grave deeper while I quietly protected my interests. The wedding was only 3 weeks away, and I couldn't bear the thought of Michael's perfect day being overshadowed by his parents' divorce drama. So I chose to wait, to play the role of the devoted wife for just a little longer while I documented every asset, every account, every investment that David thought he was hiding from me. I had no idea that David was about to make my decision much easier by showing everyone exactly who he really was. The week leading up to the wedding, David's behavior became increasingly strange. He was making comments about how expensive everything was, how much money I was wasting on flowers and photography, how Sarah's family should be paying for more since they were getting such an elaborate celebration. When I reminded him that we had agreed on the budget months ago and that I had actually come in under what we originally planned, he waved me off dismissively and muttered something about women never understanding the value of money. This from a man who had spent $30,000 on a vintage watch collection just 2 months earlier without consulting me at all. The night before the wedding, during the rehearsal dinner at the country club, where we had been members for 15 years, David had too much to drink and started making jokes about marriage that weren't really jokes at all. He told the gathered families how lucky Michael was to find a woman who appreciated the finer things in life, unlike some wives who took their husband's success for granted. He made comments about how important it was for a man to maintain control of his finances so his wife couldn't spend him into bankruptcy on frivolous things like flowers and fancy parties. Sarah's parents exchanged uncomfortable glances, and I saw Michael's jaw tighten with embarrassment. But I just smiled and played my part, knowing that in less than 24 hours, David would reveal his true character to everyone who mattered. The morning of the wedding, I got up early and went to the venue to supervise the final setup. The florists were arranging the last of the centerpieces, the catering staff was preparing for the afternoon service, and the photographer was already capturing the behind-the-scenes moments that would become treasured memories. I felt calm in a way I hadn't experienced in years, maybe decades. There's something liberating about knowing exactly who you're dealing with, about having all the evidence you need to protect yourself, about finally being ready to stop pretending that someone else's opinion of your worth has any bearing on your actual value as a human being. David arrived at the venue 2 hours before the ceremony, already complaining about the cost of valet parking and making snide remarks about how much money we were wasting on details that no one would remember in 5 years. He criticized the flower arrangements I had personally selected, questioned the menu choices I had spent weeks perfecting with the chef, and made disparaging comments about Sarah's wedding dress, which cost less than one of his golf weekends, but was somehow too extravagant for his taste. I listened to his complaints with the serene patience of someone who knew this would be the last time I would ever have to endure his criticism or seek his approval for anything. During the ceremony, I watched our son pledge his love to Sarah with tears in my eyes, thinking about the kind of marriage I had hoped to have when I was her age, the partnership of equals I had dreamed of before I learned to make myself smaller to accommodate David's ego. Michael and Sarah promised to respect each other, to support each other's dreams, to face life's challenges as a team. Their vows were everything mine had never been, and I felt so proud of the man my son had become despite his father's example of what a husband should be. You know what touches my heart most about sharing these stories with you? It's knowing that somewhere out there, someone is listening who needs to hear that they're not alone, that their experiences matter, that their feelings are valid. If you're finding strength in this story, if you're recognizing pieces of your own journey in these words, would you do something for me? Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're creating more than just a channel here. We're building a safe space where real stories are told and real healing happens. Drop a comment below and tell me about a time when you found the courage to stand up for yourself, even when it was scary. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. The reception started beautifully. Our families mingled easily, the music was perfect, and the food was receiving compliments from every table. I danced with Michael during the mother-son dance, holding my baby boy close and whispering how proud I was of the man he had become and how much I loved Sarah. I danced with Sarah's father, who thanked me repeatedly for making his daughter's day so special. I even danced with David during the obligatory anniversary dance they held for all the married couples, though his grip on my hand felt more possessive than affectionate, more like he was marking his territory than celebrating our partnership. The moment that changed everything came during the toasts, after Michael and Sarah had thanked both families for their love and support, after Sarah's maid of honor had shared embarrassing childhood stories that made everyone laugh, after David's best man had given a touching speech about friendship and commitment. The DJ announced that the father of the groom wanted to say a few words, and David stood up with a confidence that should have been my first warning about what was coming. He had been drinking steadily throughout the reception, and there was something in his eyes that I had learned to recognize over the years, a combination of arrogance and cruelty that appeared whenever he felt the need to establish his dominance over someone he perceived as weaker. David took the microphone with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to commanding a room's attention. He started conventionally enough, talking about how proud he was of Michael, how beautiful Sarah looked, how wonderful it was to see two families coming together in celebration. But then his tone shifted, became more personal, more pointed. He started talking about marriage as a business partnership, about the importance of clearly defined roles, about how successful marriages required one partner to be the provider and the other to be grateful for being provided for. The room grew uncomfortable as guests began to realize that this wasn't a typical father of the groom speech, that something darker was emerging from what should have been a moment of joy and celebration. Then David looked directly at me, smiled that cruel smile I knew so well, and said the words that would end our marriage in front of 200 witnesses. He told the room that he wanted to thank his wife for finally learning her place after 26 years, for understanding that her job was to look pretty and spend his money wisely, for accepting that she had never actually contributed anything meaningful to their family's success beyond producing children and maintaining their social calendar. He said that I was essentially a very expensive housekeeper who happened to share his last name, and that he hoped Sarah would be smarter than I had been and find ways to actually add value to Michael's life beyond just existing in his house. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see Michael's face burning with shame and anger, could see Sarah's hands trembling as she reached for her new husband's arm, could see my daughters staring at their father in horror and disbelief. Sarah's parents looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor, and several of our friends were clearly trying to figure out if they should intervene somehow. David seemed oblivious to the shocked expressions surrounding him, pleased with himself for what he obviously thought was a clever and amusing observation about modern marriage dynamics. He raised his glass and proposed a toast to wives who know their place and husbands who provide well for their families. I stood up slowly, smoothing down my navy dress, the one I had chosen specifically because David had once told me it made me look dignified and appropriate for important family occasions. I walked over to where David stood holding the microphone, and in a voice that carried clearly throughout the silent ballroom, I asked if I could add a few words to his toast. He handed me the microphone with a patronizing smile, probably expecting me to thank him for his wonderful speech or to make some self-deprecating joke about my role as the family's decorative accessory. Instead, I looked out at the faces of everyone we had invited to celebrate our son's wedding. People who had known us for years, people who respected and cared about our family, and I told them the truth. I thanked David for finally being honest about how he viewed our marriage, because his words had just made my next decision incredibly easy to explain. I told our guests that 3 weeks ago, I had discovered that my husband had forged my signature on legal documents designed to cheat me out of my rightful share of assets I had helped him accumulate over more than 2 decades of marriage. I explained that he had hidden bank accounts and investments from me while simultaneously criticizing me for spending money on our son's wedding, money that legally belonged to both of us regardless of whose name was on the paycheck. I informed the room that David's speech had just provided me with 200 witnesses to his true character, people who could now testify to his publicly stated belief that wives are essentially expensive servants rather than equal partners in marriage. Then I handed the microphone back to David, whose face had gone completely white as he realized what had just happened, and I announced that I would be filing for divorce first thing Monday morning, that I had already secured legal representation, and that David's attempt to defraud me of my marital assets had actually made him liable for significant financial penalties beyond the normal division of property. I wished Michael and Sarah a long and happy marriage filled with mutual respect and genuine partnership, apologized to both families for David's inappropriate behavior, and suggested that everyone return to celebrating the beautiful union we were supposed to be honoring instead of witnessing the public destruction of a marriage that had been over for much longer than anyone realized. The aftermath was swift and devastating for David's carefully constructed image. Michael immediately approached me to apologize for his father's behavior and to tell me he supported whatever decisions I needed to make for my own well-being. Sarah hugged me and whispered that she was proud of how I had handled myself with such grace under impossible circumstances. Several of our longtime friends made a point of coming over to express their shock at David's speech and their admiration for my composure in responding to it. David, meanwhile, seemed to be slowly realizing that his moment of public humiliation had just cost him everything he thought he could take for granted. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of supportive conversations and meaningful glances. People kept approaching me to express their admiration for my dignity in the face of such public disrespect, and many shared their own stories of marriages where one partner had been taken for granted for far too long. Sarah's mother pulled me aside to tell me that she had always suspected David didn't appreciate what he had in me, and that his behavior tonight had confirmed her worst impressions of his character. Even some of David's business colleagues made uncomfortable jokes about how he had probably just given his divorce attorney enough material to retire early, comments that made it clear they understood exactly how badly he had miscalculated the consequences of his public humiliation campaign. David spent the remainder of the evening trying to do damage control, approaching various guests to explain that he had been joking, that people had misunderstood his sense of humor, that his speech had been taken out of context. But there was no context that could make his words acceptable, no explanation that could undo the cruelty of publicly degrading his wife at their son's wedding. Several people simply walked away when he tried to minimize what had happened, and others told him directly that his behavior had been inexcusable, regardless of whatever marital problems he might be experiencing privately. Michael and Sarah left for their honeymoon the next morning, but not before Michael called to check on me and to reiterate that he supported whatever decisions I needed to make about my marriage. He told me that he had been embarrassed by his father's treatment of me for years, that he had noticed David's increasing disrespect and condescension, and that last night's speech had simply made public what the family had been witnessing privately for far too long. He said that Sarah had been horrified by David's behavior and had spent their wedding night crying about how their special day had been tainted by his cruelty and selfishness. Monday morning arrived gray and rainy, which felt appropriate for the day I would officially end my 26-year marriage. Patricia had prepared all the necessary documents over the weekend, working with a private investigator to document every hidden asset and every instance of financial deception David had attempted. The prenuptial agreement with my forged signature was Exhibit A in a case that would ultimately cost David far more than if he had simply been honest about our finances from the beginning. His attempt to cheat me out of my rightful share of our marital property had backfired spectacularly, making him liable for punitive damages, legal fees, and a property division that favored me significantly due to his fraudulent behavior. The divorce proceedings that followed were swift and decisive. David's attorney tried to argue that his client's speech at the wedding had been taken out of context, that the forged prenup was a misunderstanding, that the hidden assets were legitimate business practices. but Patricia had documented everything thoroughly. And we had 200 witnesses to David's public declaration that he viewed marriage as a relationship between a provider and a dependent, rather than a partnership between equals. The judge was particularly unimpressed with David's attempt to defraud me through forged documents, and the final settlement awarded me significantly more than half of our assets as compensation for his deceptive practices. I want to pause here and say something to anyone listening who might be in a similar situation, anyone who feels undervalued or taken for granted in their relationship. Your worth is not determined by someone else's ability to recognize it. You don't need permission to stand up for yourself, and you don't need to accept treatment that makes you feel small or insignificant. If this story is resonating with you, if you're finding courage in these words, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we're going to keep sharing stories that remind you of your strength and your value. And in the comments below, I want you to tell me one thing you're proud of about yourself today. One way you've grown or changed or stood up for what you deserved. Your story matters, and sharing it might be exactly what someone else needs to hear. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I bought a beautiful townhouse in the historic district downtown, a place that was entirely mine, decorated according to my taste, filled with art and books and music that brought me joy rather than impressed other people. I started taking pottery classes on Tuesday evenings and joined a book club that met monthly at the local coffee shop. I reconnected with college friends I had lost touch with during the years when my entire social life revolved around David's career advancement. I discovered that I actually enjoyed my own company, that I had interests and opinions and dreams that had been buried under decades of making myself smaller to accommodate someone else's ego. The most surprising development was how quickly David's professional reputation began to suffer once word spread about his behavior at the wedding. Several business contacts distanced themselves from him, uncomfortable with associating with someone who had publicly humiliated his wife in such a cruel manner. His company's human resources department received complaints from female employees who felt unsafe working for someone who clearly had such demeaning attitudes toward women. Within a year, David had been forced into early retirement, though the generous severance package he received was significantly reduced by the alimony and property settlements he owed me as a result of his fraudulent behavior. Michael and Sarah returned from their honeymoon more committed than ever to building the kind of marriage based on mutual respect and genuine partnership that they had witnessed was possible through their own relationship. They made a point of including me in family gatherings and celebrations, and Sarah often sought my advice about everything from career decisions to home decorating. Watching their marriage flourish gave me hope about love and relationships in a way I hadn't felt in decades. 2 years later, I was standing in the kitchen of my townhouse preparing dinner for Michael and Sarah, who were coming over to share some exciting news, when my doorbell rang unexpectedly. Through the peephole, I could see David standing on my front porch, looking older and more tired than I remembered, holding what appeared to be a bouquet of flowers and wearing the kind of nervous expression I hadn't seen on his face since our early dating days. I opened the door, but didn't invite him in, curious about what could possibly bring him to my home after all this time and after everything that had happened between us. David began with an apology that was both too little and far too late, explaining that he had spent the past 2 years in therapy trying to understand why he had treated me so badly, why he had felt the need to diminish my contributions to our marriage and our family. He said that losing me had forced him to confront some ugly truths about himself, about his need to feel superior to the people closest to him, about his deep-seated insecurities that had manifested as cruelty and control. He claimed that he finally understood how much I had sacrificed for our family, how much my support had contributed to his professional success, how much my love and dedication had meant even when he was too selfish and self-absorbed to acknowledge it. He told me about how his life had fallen apart after our divorce, how he had lost not just his marriage but many of his friendships and professional relationships, how people had been repulsed by his behavior at the wedding and his treatment of me throughout our marriage. He said that he had been forced to face the reality that his public humiliation of me had revealed something about his character that people found fundamentally unacceptable, that his attempt to make me look small had actually made him look petty, cruel, and deeply insecure. He admitted that he had destroyed the best thing in his life because he had been too proud and too foolish to appreciate what he had while he had it. I listened to his speech with the same calm composure I had maintained that night at the wedding reception, recognizing the performance aspects of his contrition while also hearing what sounded like genuine regret and self-awareness. When he finished talking and handed me the flowers, I thanked him for the apology and told him that I was glad he had found therapy helpful in understanding his behavior. But I also made it clear that his personal growth journey, while admirable, didn't change the fact that our marriage was over and that I had moved on to a life that was healthier and happier than anything we had ever built together. David asked if there was any possibility of reconciliation, any chance that we could start over with the wisdom and maturity he claimed to have gained through losing everything that mattered to him. I looked at this man who had shared my life for over 2 decades, who had fathered my children, who had once been the person I thought I would grow old with, and I felt nothing but a kind of peaceful indifference. The love I had once felt for him was gone, not destroyed by anger or bitterness, but simply evolved beyond the point where his presence or absence had any significant impact on my emotional well-being. I explained to David that forgiveness didn't require me to forget what had happened or to expose myself to the possibility of being hurt in the same ways again. I told him that I had forgiven him for my own peace of mind, not because he deserved it, but because carrying anger and resentment was exhausting and ultimately self-destructive. But forgiveness didn't mean I was willing to rebuild a relationship with someone who had demonstrated such capacity for cruelty and deception, someone who had required the complete destruction of his life before he was motivated to examine his own behavior and attitudes. When Michael and Sarah arrived an hour later, they found me arranging David's flowers in a vase, smiling with the contentment of someone who had finally found her way to the other side of a painful chapter. Sarah was glowing with the kind of happiness that made me suspect what their big news might be, and Michael looked prouder and more excited than I had seen him since his wedding day. Over dinner, they announced that I was going to be a grandmother, that their first child was due in 6 months, and that they hoped I would be as involved in their baby's life as I wanted to be. Sitting around my dining table with my son and daughter-in-law, planning for the arrival of my first grandchild, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment. David's public humiliation had been the catalyst I needed to finally stand up for myself, to recognize my own worth, to refuse to accept treatment that diminished my value as a human being. His cruelty had been the gift that forced me to build a life based on my own choices rather than his approval, a life that was authentically mine rather than a performance designed to make someone else feel important. The baby arrived on a snowy February morning, a perfect little girl named Emma, who immediately became the center of our world. Holding my granddaughter for the first time, I thought about the woman I wanted her to see when she looked at me, the example I wanted to set about standing up for yourself and refusing to accept less than you deserve. I wanted Emma to grow up knowing that her worth wasn't determined by other people's opinions, that her voice mattered, that she had the right to demand respect and genuine love rather than settling for relationships that required her to make herself smaller. David never remarried, and according to Michael, he spent his remaining years alone, apparently having learned too late that real love requires genuine respect and appreciation rather than dominance and control. I often wondered if he ever understood that his speech at the wedding had actually freed me from a marriage that had been suffocating my spirit for years, that his moment of cruelty had been the catalyst for me to finally reclaim my life and my worth. Looking back now, I can honestly say that being publicly humiliated by my husband at our son's wedding was one of the best things that ever happened to me. Not because I enjoyed the pain of that moment, but because it gave me the clarity and courage I needed to finally choose myself. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives are actually doorways to the best chapters, opportunities to discover strength we didn't know we had, and to build lives that honor who we really are rather than who other people expect us to be. The woman who stood up in that ballroom 2 years ago was someone I had forgotten I could be, and I'll be forever grateful to her for having the courage to speak her truth and claim her worth, regardless of the consequences. Thank you so much for staying with me through this entire journey. Your presence here means more to me than you know, and I hope this story reminded you of your own strength and value. Before you go, I want you to click on one of the videos appearing on your screen right now to stay connected with our community of strong, beautiful souls who refuse to settle for less than they deserve. Until next time, remember that you are worthy of respect, love, and all the beautiful things life has to offer.